What's up, folks? This is Justin from Books, Bricks, and Boards. If you're a fan of the channel, you probably know I started off in Beckme and then moved on to 2nd edition D&D. But you might not know, the first edition that I owned was Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. I had a relative that was upgrading to 2nd edition. Those 1st edition books didn't mean anything to him anymore, so he gave them to me. And as a 8 or 9-year-old kid, that was about the best gift I could imagine. It was wonderful. It was a great gift. And in a lot of ways, I think that Advanced Dungeons & Dragons is really Gary's greatest gift to his game. So we're going to talk about that today. If you are enjoying the content, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe, as that may just be the only way to keep Lorraine Williams from buying the channel and changing its focus to Buck Rogers. Of course, if you want to dive a bit deeper and meet the greatest gamers in the prime material plane, head on over to Books, Bricks, and Boards University Discord channel. Join us. Link in the description. History of the game. In 1974, Tactical Studies Rules released the original Dungeons & Dragons box set. The game was an attempt to codify the manner in which Dave Arneson had been using Gary Gygax's fantasy supplement for the Chainmail Miniatures game. David found that, in focusing upon individual heroes instead of entire armies, the story became much more rich and the players more engaged. This was really a perfect storm of creativity and opportunity, but it wasn't without its flaws. For one thing, the original box set required outside materials, such as the aforementioned Chainmail and Fantasy Supplement rules, and, as it was the first attempt at a true RPG experience, there were no tried-and-true methods to follow along the way. Just as there were no guidelines to aid in the game's creation, so too there were no clear-cut best practices in teaching the game either. Most gamers at the time were learning from other experienced players rather than straight from the rules. Ken St. Andre, author of Tunnels and Trolls, has stated that it was from his frustration in trying to learn from the original box set that he was inspired to write his own game. Despite the flaws and the additional setback of Gygax and Arneson rarely seeing eye to eye on the direction that the game should go, D&D was still very successful. Gygax realized that in order to take their game to the masses, it needed to be more clear, more robust, and more defined. Around Arneson's departure from the company, Gygax began his work on the advanced edition of the game, while also having fellow gamer and physician John Eric Holmes work on building an introductory version of the game, which would become the Blue Basic box set, also called Holmes Basic. Holmes Basic set would be a revision of the original Dungeons & Dragons, more than the introduction to Advanced Dungeons & Dragons that TSR was hoping for, but all the same, it released in 1977, the same year as the first of the 3 core AD&D books, the Monster Manual. Because Gary needed time and cash flow to release the full advanced version of the game, he released 1 book a year, helping to fund future installments with cash from sales of the basic set, as well as the previous released AD&D books. The Monster Manual was the natural choice to start with, as it was the easiest to use alongside existing D&D materials, making it valuable to gamers immediately. The next release in 1978 was the Player's Handbook, with the iconic idol with the gemstone eyes and the fallen lizard men on the cover. This book made core many of the classes that had been previously released in supplemental materials, and that remain largely the foundational classes of the game to this day. Of course, the Player's Handbook also revealed painfully little about many of the core mechanics of the system itself, preferring to keep them secrets for the DMs alone to fully understand.
Keep it secret. Keep it secret.
In 1979, Gary gave us what I consider to be the best Dungeon Master's Guide to ever grace our shelves. True, it is not without its flaws, but it offers more insight into the man's style of running a game than we'd ever get anywhere else. Through all of the Gygaxian prose and often seemingly contradicting his own previous statements, this guide provided such a wealth of knowledge that it is, in this creator's opinion, a must-read for aspiring DMs. Of course, AD&D would expand its line with another monster manual appropriately named Monster Manual 2, as well as Deities and Demigods, later renamed Legends and Lore, the Fiend Folio, the Wilderness and Dungeoneer Survival Guides, Oriental Adventures, Dragonlance Adventures, Greyhawk Adventures, the Manual of the Plains, as well as full campaign settings, adventures, and more Dragon magazine materials than you can shake a staff of striking at. Of course, of all the aforementioned releases, none created as much controversy during their day as Unearthed Arcana. This was a bit of a mishmash of material that had been previously released in articles as well as new material that Gary wanted to add to the game. It proved to be incredibly popular with players and helped to inject cash into the business during a time that it was much needed. Also, unless I am mistaken, it was probably the last major publishing project that Gary was deeply involved in for the game. His name is on Oriental Adventures, but by many accounts, he was all but absent for its development. Not long after Unearthed Arcana was flying off the shelves, Gary was ousted from the company and went off to work on projects of his own, but none that matched the cultural impact of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. Not long after his departure, TSR worked on releasing a second edition of the game, which Gary had hinted at in a Dragon article shortly before his exit, though his suggested changes were quite different than what that edition ended up becoming. And so it would be that Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, the first edition, remained a reflection of the game that bore Gary's mark more than any other. The core 4 releases. 1977 Monster Manual. While small by today's standards, the AD&D Monster Manual served to create many of the tropes of fantasy monsters that permeate the hobby to this very day. It creatively mixed myth and imagination into a pile of legends and lore that resonated with players everywhere. The release was marked by its distinctive art style, which has seen a revival in recent years with many of the OSR-related games on the market today. 1978, Player's Handbook. Unimaginably vague in comparison to modern players' handbooks, this was clearly a time when there was meant to be archaic knowledge that would remain a mystery to the players. The book establishes most of the foundational races of the game with dwarf, elf, gnome, half-elf, halfling, half-orc, and human, for the most part with similar advantages and disadvantages as we see today. As for classes, excepting for the assassin, those included here are still the mainstays to this day as well, with the cleric, druid, fighter, paladin, ranger, magic user, illusionist, thief, and monk. This book also introduced us to many staple pieces of armor and equipment common today, while also displaying Gary's fascination with the wide variety of polearms found throughout history.
Hey, what more can a guy ask for?
As for some of the oddities here, we have versions of psionic rules, albeit as an optional rule. If anyone ever used these regularly, please comment below, as I'd love to get an honest take on these. There was also a very confounding implementation of the Bard class, which involved first playing through several levels of other classes before ever becoming an actual Bard. 1979, The Dungeon Master's Guide. This book would have been a huge treasure trove of information in the pre-internet days, and truthfully remains so today if you're willing to deal with some long-winded discussions about subjects that may very well seem trivial through a lens of modern game design. Within the pages of the DMG, one would find tables and concepts galore covering aging, disease, ancestral dispositions, explanations of the meaning of hit points, various types of special combat including aerial, waterborne, and underwater, for example, psionics, economics, social structure, monster placement and populations, a sample dungeon, random dungeon creation, with a small section on using said creation for solo play, extensive NPC personality generation tools, random wilderness generation tools, random encounter tables for every conceivable environ, and amongst many other things, the legendary Appendix N. If when flipping through these pages you can't find anything that perks your interest, I can only surmise that you might not be trying very hard. While, as I said, this DMG is not without its flaws, it has more than enough merit to warrant the huge praise that it has received in the decades since it was released. 1985, Unearthed Arcana. Even my inclusion of this book amongst the core releases will, I am sure, create strong feelings and a few negative reactions all these decades later. But to that I would offer that AD&D was really Gary's vision of the game during the time he was leading TSR, and during that time he felt that its inclusion was how the game would be moving forward. With that aside out of the way, Unearthed Arcana was certainly a mixed bag, with the nearly pointless addition of the 7th attribute, comeliness, which nobody I knew used, It canonized numerous racial subtypes that remain popular to this day, including the Drow amongst many others. New rules for weapon specialization and increased attack rates were added, the former being for fighters and rangers only notably. But perhaps the most popular and controversial section would be the new classes. Unearthed Arcana added the Cavalier, which many deemed to be overpowered, and added an interesting negative level mechanic if your status was not sufficient to start as a true Cavalier. The ultimate mounted warrior, the Cavalier was stout and capable, and in some ways that I consider justifiable, provided a clearly better option than the existing fighter or paladin. Of course, the Cavalier was great, but my favorite of the Unearthed Arcana classes was the Barbarian, my second favorite Barbarian iteration of any edition, with the first being Talanian's take on the class in Hyperborea. The Barbarian was durable, capable in combat, versatile in his abilities, and in many ways trod upon the roles of thieves, rangers, and fighters, being a very close reflection of the Conan that we see in the pulps noted in Appendix N. That said, it wasn't without its disadvantages either, with a steep experience requirement for leveling and some serious role-playing drawbacks regarding their comfort level with magic. Of course, if your DM didn't hold you to these role-playing drawbacks, which many did not, the class became all the more powerful, which in turn contributed to its reputation of being overpowered, fairly or unfairly. The last of the new classes was the Thief Acrobat, whereby thieves could become Thief Acrobats upon reaching the requisite level, but in doing so would lose the ability to advance many of their base thief skills in favor of gaining additional acrobatic skills. Honestly, I never really liked the design of this class, and some parts, such as the tumbling maneuver attack percentages, never made any sense to me at all. That being the case, when it comes to the new classes, as Meatloaf stated, 2 out of 3 ain't bad. Beyond all of this, Unearthed Arcana added numerous spells and weapons, deities of demi-humans, and most scary of all, an entire appendix on polearms, because of course he did. Pros of AD&D. Number 1. It's a hobbyist's game. AD&D is meant to be fiddled with and changed, and in many ways the tinkering is half of the fun. Number 2. Musings of the Master. Getting to take a peek into the thought process of the dungeonist dungeon master of them all is a great source of inspiration. Number 3. Simple in execution, if not instruction. While the game can be difficult to parse out from a quick read, once you have played it, the core mechanical play elements are really quite simple. Number 4. The art that defined the hobby. Looking through the sketch art that adorns much of the pages of these ancient tomes will instantly bring you back to the foundational time of this hobby. Number 5. More than the mechanics. As a game has a certain mysterious quality to it that can be seen in a variety of polearms, the great detail in which building a stronghold is discussed, and the manner in which the minutiae can at times take the front stage. It is in this concept that I find myself wanting to revisit this strange and unique moment in gaming time. Cons of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. Number 1. Layout. By modern standards, the layout is painful to pore through. Even by the standard of the day, it seems that while Gary had ample creativity, his ability to convey ideas in clear and concise formats was limited. Number 2. Balance. If balance is important to you as a gamer, AD&D is not going to give you much comfort. The game is meant to be exciting and fun, not necessarily balanced. Number 3. Perplexing prose. Gygaxian writing is an acquired taste that some will never acquire. If brevity and clarity is important, tread not these halls. Number 4. Alien concepts. There will be some elements of this game that will frustrate or even enrage players raised on modern iterations of the game. From gender-based attribute caps to descending AC, or even the lack of Dragonborn, there may be too different a foundation for some gamers to handle. Number 5. Lost wisdom of the ages. I have heard many times that no one played this game exactly as written, and that is probably for the most part true. However, there were a lot of common knowledge homebrew fixes implemented in groups across the community, which are sadly almost entirely lost today. Because those communities that birthed these ideas have been lost to the sands of time. This almost certainly causes a loss of some of what made this edition so special to begin with. How to start AD&D in 2024. 3 options. Number 1, PDFs or print on demand of the originals, available on DriveThruRPG. These are inexpensive, of course they have total fidelity, and they have a very good catalog. Number 2, Osric. This has a free PDF available, it's cheap in print, it's a much more usable format, and it is nearly a one-to-one recreation of the game. Number 3, original copies. These are very expensive, fragile, and not for the faint of heart. Summary. Who will Advanced Dungeons & Dragons appeal to in 2024? Lapsed gamers? The historically curious, those enjoying the OSR scene and looking for the ultimate OSR experience, who will not appreciate Advanced Dungeons & Dragons in 2024. Gamers with decidedly modern sensibilities, those unwilling or disinterested in trying foundational mechanics, those looking for innovation over tradition. What do I think? I had my formative years in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd Edition, and before that, BECME, and therefore, I have a natural bias in favor of those versions of the game. That said, with the right group, I'd happily play or run a 1st edition game. Moreover, some of the best non-gaming enjoyment I get out of this hobby, other than discussing games with you all, is pouring through these old dusty tomes, and in this regard, Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 1st edition continues to spark my imagination and inspire my creations to this very day. That's what I think, but I'd love to hear what you think about AD&D 1st edition. Have you played this version of the game? If so, what do you like about it? And what do you dislike? Is there a particular house rule that you always played with? Was Unearthed Arcana welcome at your table? Let's talk about all of this in the comments. Until next time, this has been Justin for Books, Bricks, and Boards. Good gaming, and God bless.